I'd like to thank the American Theosophical Society for putting this program together and for their invitation out for this particular program, and also to Director John Cianciosi for arranging and leading this important society, an important society which values thought, integration and wholeness of human beings. And particularly, I think, at this time in our country and around the world, it's really important that more formats and venues such as this are available for people to witness and hear different kinds of views that enrich our lives and elevate both our intellect and our soul. So I hope that we can continue to see more of those. I was just telling John earlier that, I've been in this area, living here for several years now, and oftentimes I'll pass through not knowing what this particular society or what's really behind that very long front yard and this building. And I've been lecturing recently at many churches nearby, and then of course when I go to court, it's in Wheaton as well. So I'm glad I finally stopped by. I think it's important, again, that we discuss important subjects and characters in history, and one of those, of course, is Jalaluddin Rumi. So we'll be talking about him today. Now, his life and thought is just so pervasive, is so deep and comprehensive. We can't really cover everything in the space of time that we have. So I'll touch upon certain things, and hopefully some of your questions afterwards can elicit further discussion that I didn't touch upon, and feel free to do that. And perhaps later on at other moments and other times we can come back and dig deeper. Rumi is really a fascinating character in the history of religions. Even within the context of Islamic thought and history, he's a fascinating character. So what I'm going to do today is touch a little bit about the political environment by which he was born, the religious environment, the literary output that he produced, which really is unfathomable for many of us, and then basically talk a little bit and go over some of his most well-known poems and statements. He is reputed to have produced something along 60,000 lines of poetry. So obviously, we're not going to be able to even give anything close to that, unless you want me to read to you all night. Like I said, we'll just touch upon that today. But let's begin with what he says in the prose section of the introduction to one of his most epic poems called the Mathnavi. And here he describes what the Mathnavi really is intended and it's for. He says the Mathnavi is a path for those who want to attain the truth, what he calls haqiqat, the truth, the divine, the reality, if you will, and to be aware of the secrets of God. The Mathnavi, this epic poem that he's producing, is the essence of the essence of the essence of religion. Okay, just in case you didn't get that. It is a cure for the sick hearts. And here we mean the spiritual hearts, right? And the purge of the sorrows, and the expounder of the Quran, and the source of divine gifts, and the means for cleansing the sordid dispositions. And in a nutshell, this really provides you what the purpose of that epic poem, the Mathnavi, is. Now, literally, the Mathnavi means really a body of work filled with couplets of poetry, which has various purposes and meanings. That's what really Mathnavi is. And it's a poetic form that develops in Persia just maybe a century and a half before Rumi. So let's then pick up and talk about then the political environment and his background. Who is this guy? What did he come from? That is even so fascinating as well. Rumi, interestingly enough, is part of a Western migration of the Turkic people that begins approximately in the 11th century. This was preceded by a group of Turks that were brought into the Middle East to serve as soldiers, slave soldiers for the Caliph of Baghdad. And then 100 years later, you begin to see a migration of Turkish tribes coming from Central Asia into the Middle East, eventually winding up into what is today Turkey or Anatolia. And it's interesting because, and this is really the appropriate time to mention his role, and Rumi is he's a migrant. He's a refugee. He's a refugee from his homeland. His family leaves his original homeland, which is either the town of Balkh, which is in Afghanistan, or the town of Vaksh, which is just a little bit away from there, today what would be called Tajikistan. Okay? So on the border of Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So it's an ambiguous location, but nevertheless, it's that Central Asian Afghan region that he's from. So he's a Turk, ethnically speaking. His family then migrates to the Middle East. Why? Because his father apparently either was looking for a new job prospect because he lost favor with some of the people there, or his father was simply looking to travel. I think the first story is probably more credible than the second one. They go to Baghdad, they go to Damascus, they even go on their pilgrimage, and they find nothing. Why? Because those are all taken, right? They're all scholars there, they're all produced, and we don't need some Turk from Afghanistan coming here and teaching us and so forth. So he finally winds up in the region of what at that time was known as the Sultanate of Rum, or Sultanate of Rome. So he's from this area here, and they migrate, come to Baghdad, come to the pilgrimage, Damascus, and finally they wind up over here in what is present-day Konya. You have a little map here showing the Sultanate of Rome, or Rum. So the word Rum itself refers to, it is the Quranic term to describe the Roman Empire or Byzantium. So that's why he's called Rumi. That's not his real name. It's an appellation that's applied because he's from that region called Rum. And these are some pictures of the buildings actually that were constructed in that time. The famous Mosque of Konya, actually the Mosque of the Seljuks in Konya, remains standing here. This is another section of that. This was the gateway into Konya here, which is basically falling apart, so they constructed a thing over it. The mountainside of Konya, as you get into the city, you can see it's filled with valleys and mountains. More countryside villages that you pass by. And this is what Konya would have looked like during the time of Rumi. This is present-day Turkey, where this is downtown Konya, and this is the main mosque there. This happens to be the shrine of Rumi, and this is the courtyard inside, which has the fountain for ablution for prayers. And this finally is the entryway to the tomb. And I don't know how many people here speak Persian. Anybody speak Persian or Arabic? Nobody? Really? I thought there'd be some in here. Okay. This says, Ya Hazrat Maulana. In other words, O our beloved master. In Persian, and particularly in Turkey, when you say Maulana or Ya Hazrat Maulana, it refers to Rumi. Okay? That's the entryway, and there's his tomb right there. And then it's also surrounded by members of his family and so forth. Okay, this is what the area looked like in terms of the different people or different tribes that inhabited Anatolia. And this is the Sultanate of Rum again, called Rome, but Rum. And this is what it looked like before the Ottomans. So Rumi lives between 1207 to about 1273. So this is just prior to the rise of the Ottomans. But he also lived at an incredibly troubled time, a turbulent time, because this was the period of time when the Mongols were coming from the Central Asian and China region and sweeping into this area. In fact, during his lifetime, they had sacked Baghdad and burned the city to the ground and beheaded the caliph. And it had almost a convulsion effect on Islamic society and in the Middle East. So it was a very troubling time. And that's what's so ironic, that during this incredible political instability, that this person produced incredible spiritual literature that really has been unsurpassed. And that's what makes it interesting, because he's not living in a comfortable suburban lifestyle where he has all the time in the world to write things. He's living in a very troubled time and so forth. So let's skip ahead. Okay, so what were some of the influences on him? Okay, I've already talked about the fact that he's from Central Asia, so there's aspects of that that's important. He left that region when he was probably around 10. He spoke 3 languages, okay, and those were required because his dad was a very important scholar. And usually when you're an important Islamic scholar, you are pretty much well-versed in Arabic regardless of your ethnic background. So here's a Turk who speaks Turkish, but yet he has to learn Arabic to master all of the education in Islam. And yet, for purposes of poetry, he had to learn Persian and knew Persian well enough that he can really write some of the best poetry in the Persian language ever. In terms of his religious orientation, he was, of course, being a Muslim scholar, he has to be a practicing Muslim, but he was a Hanafi jurist. A Hanafi, which means that it's one of the 5 major schools of Islamic thought where you interpret the sources according to a particular legal methodology. And in terms of his theological orientation, he's known as a Maturidi, which means, again, it refers to a certain theological disposition regarding all kinds of things about free will, existence of God, and so on and so forth. But one of the biggest influences besides his ethnic background and religion, of course, was his father, named Bahauddin al-Walad. And he's often known as the Sultan of Ulama because he was very well respected. And then finally, when his father passed away, his father was teaching now in Konya, and ultimately everyone knew that his son, Jalaluddin, would replace him. But in the interim, there was another teacher that his father had brought over by the name of Burhanuddin, while Rumi finished up his studies. So Rumi, after living in Konya, travels and goes back to Baghdad, goes back to Damascus to master the art of Arabic and other religious sciences, and then comes back and then takes the helm of his father and is the main teacher, if you will, of the madrasa in Konya. Later on, of course, the famous story occurs where he, at the age of 35 or 37, meets this character, a guy by the name of Shams al-Tabrizi, which basically alters his life to such a degree that subsequently he embarks on this poetic journey, which creates an incredible volcanic eruption of poetry, so that for the next 30 years, he produces 60,000 lines of poetry. Some scholars have estimated that that comes out to about 14 to 15 lines of verse per day in a really unimpeachable and beautiful manner. After Shams al-Tabrizi, he then had other students named Salahuddin Husamuddin, and of course his son too, Sultan Walad, who also carried on his mantle. And those students and his son ultimately begin what's known as the Mathnavi order. This is the Sufi order, which is famous for? Right, the whirling dervishes. Those are the whirling dervishes. It comes from Rumi's teachings and ultimately his students and his son who begin this practice of spinning as a way to elevate the soul and as a form of Islamic spiritual meditation. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of his sort of background, culturally, historically, and so forth. Let's talk about the religious influence here and what this ultimately is. How does Rumi fit in to the contours of Islamic spirituality and religion and education? After the development of Islam a couple hundred years, you begin to see the formation of specific institutions of learning, particularly in the areas of law, then theology, and ultimately in what we call mysticism or tasawwuf. By the way, does anybody know where the term Sufism comes from? Because a lot of times the term Islamic mysticism or tasawwuf is interchanged with the term Sufism. Anybody know? No? Because the term tasawwuf is Arabic, right? It's Arabic sounding. But Sufism has an ism in it. So that's not an Arabic word. It's an English word, right? Where does that come from? It actually was used in the 19th century when British colonial administrators went to India and they saw certain behaviors of Sufi gurus and practitioners different from the traditional Orthodox theologians. They said, oh, that's kind of like a Sufism kind of behavior, isn't it? And that's how it developed and becomes popularized in the modern discourse of both religion and spirituality. Anyway, so when we say Sufism, we're talking about Islamic mysticism or tasawwuf. Now, by this time, you had different schools that had developed in each of these categories. As I mentioned, the Hanafi, to which Jalaluddin belongs, but you have others, about 4 at this time. You had the development of Islamic ethical discourse. Theological schools had developed. Mystical schools had just started. Okay? And what I mean by mystical schools are these Sufi orders, fraternal orders, where a group of people would get together for social and religious reasons, centered around a spiritual master or a guru known as a sheikh, who would expound teachings and engage his students in both a elevated understanding of Islam, but also particularly certain spiritual practices, such as meditation, breathing exercises, abstaining from certain kinds of behavior which the notion of physicality and the flesh was discouraged and the spirit was more emphasized and so forth. And of course you had at the same time the development of what we called Islamic philosophy or falsafa. Now, according to Ibn Khaldun, a very important Islamic thinker in the 15th century, who is considered like the first really historical sociologist in the Islamic community, he defined tasawwuf, or the Sufi approach to Islam, as a sort of 5 criteria methodology. And I listed this here. In other words, as opposed to the legal formalistic, or what we call the exoteric element of Islam, which is the one that you can physically see when people worship. You can see them bowing, prostrating. You can see them engaging in other external practices. Here, the focus is not on that, but rather a more spiritual, esoteric element where there's a constant devotion to God, and so on and so forth. And there's a sense of what we call asceticism, in Arabic, zuhud, asceticism, and of course a sense that the world, and here what we mean by the world is the material, temporal, fleeting world, which is not the focus, and therefore retiring from that world in a form of solitude and meditation is the preferred practice. And there's some symbols that scholars have used to describe this phenomenon. And I just listed a couple here. One is that Islam is like the walnut, which is the hard core, the shell, the sharia, if you will. The kernel is the tariqah, or the spiritual pathway, and the oil is the truth, or the haqiqah. Another sort of analogy is that the sharia, or the outer practice of Islam, is the bone, and Sufism, or the inward, is the marrow. Okay, so we kind of get the sense of the outer and the inner. Okay, all right. Today, if we were to ask, what does human nature consist of? Most people would agree with the concept of the body, the soul, and the mind, right? And the body is the outward, as you can see. You can see your physicality. The body contains the senses that we use for daily living, touch, sight, smell. However, in our contemporary reality, particularly in the United States, the body has become the focus for so much of everything, for advertising in particular, but so much of athleticism and so far, sports, and so on and so forth. And the spirit, of course, is important, but not as much. The mind, of course, is important, but not as much. And the soul is really kind of sort of reduced to a small little figment that once in a while that is used as an understanding of who we are, but it's really ignored. People from a more spiritual, philosophical, or Islamic perspective flip that around so that the focus of the human being is not on the physicality or the body, but it's on the spirit or the soul. So that is the one that becomes the focus of religious practices and spiritual practices. And of course, the mind, which goes hand in hand with notions of reason and intellect and logic. And finally, the body. So the body isn't rejected and ignored, but it's minimized at the expense of the spiritual aspect. So when people typically pray, they engage in either solitary prayer, like this, or collective prayers and meditation. And this is what particularly the spiritual Sufi tasawwuf practice of Islam is known for, which is a sort of group and collective prayer. And this is often deemed controversial in certain Orthodox circles because the idea is that you pray in congregation in a sort of canonical format of prescribed prayers, but not a ceremonial kind of meditation. But nevertheless, this is so prevalent in different parts of the Muslim world, in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, that is virtually part and parcel of religious practices today. But what's interesting is that the Sufi movement, and particularly the Mathnavi order of Rumi, also engaged in something called the sama. Sama literally means hearing, but it refers to the use of musical instruments, or some kind of performance. In the case of the Mathnavi, is a spinning dance known as sama. In the South Asian context in India, the sama is often a sort of discourse of music coupled with poetry and known as the qawwali. Okay? You may have heard the concept of qawwali, which has grown internationally very much in the past decade or two. So this is the sort of essence of many Sufi practices, the meditation, the dhikr, and the sama. And of course, you're familiar with the notion of the sama as embodied and practiced by the Mathnavi order. Let's now talk about how the emphasis of the doctrines of Sufism as embodied in important Sufi thinkers such as Rumi and Al-Ghazali, what are they? And depending on the Sufi order or the Sufi thinker, you can come up with many different kinds of doctrines that they emphasize. But I believe that most people would agree that these following four that I mentioned are really the most at the heart of Sufi practice and the most prevalent that you'll find in all the different Sufi orders and thinkers. And the first, of course, which has become the focus, of course, of Rumi's teachings is love. In fact, for Rumi, it's so important that his worldview is often called the theology of love. Okay? The theology of love. Now, this is not rooted in some sort of a speculative, unorthodox practice of Islam, but it's actually rooted in Islamic tradition, particularly in the Quran, where the Quran talks about love and loving God as a central feature of faith. And in this case, this is embodied by a very famous statement by a woman Sufi from Baghdad called Rabia of Baghdad, where she emphasizes the love of God as being the most endearing and prevalent perspective as opposed to fear of God. In other words, why do we pray? Why do people of religion, whether they're Christianity, Islam, or others, why do they often pray? Because they believe that if they don't, they'll be damned, or they'll go to hell, or something bad will happen to them. In the case of Eastern religions, if they behave badly, they'll come back into a different life that is undesirable, right? And in the case of Islam, if you don't do good things, if you don't pray, you don't practice right, and you're not helping people, then you might end up in a very precarious situation on the Day of Judgment. But Rabia says, on the other hand, if I worship God for fear of you, then burn me, put me in hell. And if I worship you in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship you for your own sake and love, then please do not deny me your generosity and everlasting beauty. Okay? So it's a very sort of liberating notion that regardless of your activities, that so long as you have a God-conscious perspective, of a spiritual perspective, that you will enter the kingdom of God. That's basically what it is. Al-Ghazali, the famous 11th century theologian, probably after Rumi, certainly the most significant thinker in both spiritual Islam and general theology, says that love of God is the highest of all topics and the final aim. It's where the human development and perfection is then recognized in the notion of love. Rumi says, love is the remedy of our pride and self-conceit, the physician of all of our infirmities. Only he whose garments are rent by love becomes entirely selfish. So as you can see, this is a fundamental doctrine for these particular practitioners. And as I mentioned, for Rumi, ultimately, everything rests on the love of God, but also on the love of humanity. And this concept of loving humanity is really rooted in the sort of prophetic notion of loving people. There's a very famous tradition subscribed to the Prophet Muhammad in which he says the most important deed after belief in God is to love humanity. And therefore, you see this, despite him being a jurist, an orthodox practicing Muslim, he had a very ecumenical perspective towards other human beings, particularly because in the region of Rum, as you saw the maps that I showed you, there are pockets of different communities all over Anatolia, particularly Christians and Jews. And therefore, many Christians and Jews interacted with him, and he knew them. And it's according to tradition, when he died, there's a massive funeral in the city of Konya, and it was attended by dozens and dozens of Christians and Jews as well, as a result of that sort of ecumenical perspective that he had. Okay, the second important doctrine after love of God is what's called knowledge of God, or ma'rifah, which is basically the notion of knowing God through everything that you see around you, including the signs of nature, miracles, and other people. There's a very famous saying in tradition which says, look in your own heart, for the kingdom of God is within you. And in particular, he who truly knows himself knows God. For the heart is the mirror in which every divine quality is reflected. So the mirror here is a way to determine your spiritual state and your character qualities that need to be polished and cleaned up as you purify yourself through the notion of spiritual religious practices. Of course, there's this important aspect of, again, the connection between the heart, the spiritual heart, and the soul. Third is the notion of jihad al-nafs, in other words, the struggle against the soul, which is the idea of trying to reject the base desires and appetites that we usually encounter on a regular daily basis. So for example, if you have lustful desires, you have to then recognize that and do something else. If you're full of pride and haughty, then you should engage in certain kinds of practices. If you love wealth and you're constantly worried about driving the best cars, having the best clothes, and so on and so forth, then you try to offset those through different kinds of behaviors. A famous Sufi once said, fight your soul with the swords of discipline by eating little, sleeping briefly, speaking only when necessary, and tolerating all the wrongs done by people. Let's see. Now this one is very difficult for most Americans. This is very difficult for most teenagers. And this is very difficult for grammar school kids. And this is very difficult for all of us. So the idea here, of course, is, again, you are, in a sense, slaying the physicality of the human being, which in today's society, it's all physical. We're constantly promoting the physical nature of ourselves. But these guys and gals, they want to upend that and focus on the spiritual element. Finally is the concept of self-annihilation, or fana. And this is, in a sense, where the theosophical, the theosophical notion of a union with God is achieved at the end of this pathway that they start. The idea that you not only recognize the existence of God, not only do you obey the commands, but everything that you see around you is God. Now, some people have accused, some Sufis, in particular Rumi and Ibn Arabi, who's a very famous theosophical thinker, of a charge of pantheism, the notion that everything is God, including nature and so forth. But they would offer the rejoinder that while that sounds correct, on the other hand, there's also the emphasis that everything is not God, that God is separate and apart from creation and nature and so forth. So this notion of self-annihilation is not only a union with God in a sort of almost an ontological sense, but also a destruction of the ego, okay? It's an annihilation of the ego, because only by reducing the power of that inner ego can you really recognize God in everything, okay? Okay, so now we come to the famous meeting of Rumi and Shams al-Tabrizi. Now, Rumi is about 37, 35. He's sitting, teaching his students. He has a perfect position. He's like the leading scholar at a university, kind of like Wheaton College. Like he's like the leading theologian at Wheaton College, sitting there, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in walks this weird-looking character who's probably about 55 years old. And they have this sort of meeting of the minds and a discourse, and that basically upends his entire life. Up until this point, it's not, some writers have said that, oh, he was just an orthodox, exoteric thinker. And that's not really true. He had already been trained in some forms of Sufism and spirituality by virtue of his dad and other teachers. But nevertheless, he hadn't gone to that level of, almost to that extreme limit, or the infinity of what this path really meant, until he met Shams al-Tabrizi. And he says, I became you and you became I. I became the flesh and you became the soul. After this, nobody can claim I am separate and you are separate. Love is but a blessing and a fortune. Nothing but guidance, a dilated heart. But Hanifa never studied love. Now, remember I mentioned to you earlier that he's a Hanafi, meaning this is the founder of the juridical school called the Hanafi school. Okay? Shafi never related anything about it. Again, a Shafi refers to the scholar who represents a different school of law, exoteric practices. Okay? The law of permissible and impermissible pertain from now until. So in other words, despite him being a jurist and having mastered Islamic knowledge, education in a juridical external way, he didn't learn what it meant to have love and the notion of lovers being eternal until he meets this character. He, in his own right, was a pretty good scholar, meaning Shams al-Tabrizi, but he didn't belong to an institution. No one really knew him. He just kind of was wandering around, and boom, they meet, and next thing you know, they hit it off. And there is, as a result of this meeting, he develops this relationship for about 3 years. Okay? They become inseparable. So much so that it creates tremendous hostility by his students and family members. Because think about it, he's this beloved teacher, he's got a family, he's married, he's got children who are teenagers now, and probably, about teenagers because he married very young. And he's got students, and he's working for the local king, and he's a very respectable person. And now he's hanging out with this guy that just came out of nowhere. They're just hanging out. And people are like, who is this guy's a witch doctor? He bewitched him. What's going on? And finally, threats are made against Shams al-Tabrizi's life. He's chased out of town. And he leaves town. And Rumi is so distraught, he stops teaching. He won't see anybody. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. And he's so upset that finally he tells his son, go find this guy and bring him back. So his son and another student go, I think they went to Damascus or something, and they finally found the guy sitting somewhere, probably in a bar or hanging out or something, or whatever would constitute a bar in those days, probably a tea house, sitting in a corner by himself probably. They found him and then brought him back. And then he stayed for another probably year and a half. But then again, the hostility increases. And and lots of people get upset. Perhaps there's some jealousy and envy going on here, despite these being all Sufis. And ultimately, he one day just disappears. Just disappears. We don't know what happened. There are a couple of theories. One theory is he just got so sick of the hostility, he just left about and disappeared and went somewhere. Others is that he was murdered by either family, one of his sons, or one of the students. We don't know. Maybe it's kind of like Jimmy Hoffa kind of story. Who knows? He kind of disappears, maybe floating in a barrel somewhere, but I don't know. But after he disappears, then again, Rumi is once again distraught and so upset, but also so emotional that this poetry just comes out of him. And for the next several decades, couple of decades, he begins to write this poetry in Persian. And the one sets of poems lead to what's called the Divan-i-Shams, which is this massive, in the Persian it's called ghazal poetry, or odes, which is approximately like 40,000 lines of verse. 40,000 lines of more than Shakespeare. And an example here is this, which has both quatrains and odes. I met last night in steel with wisdom's elder, begged him to divulge in full life's secrets. This he softly, softly whispered in my ear. It must be seen. It can't be told, so hush. So this is basically a moment that he had with Shams Tabrizi, being the wisdom's elder. Like he's his teacher, basically, the master-disciple relationship that they had. A lot of people, some people have speculated that there was a physical relationship between the two. There's no evidence of that, and in particular Islamic tradition, that would not be deemed to be appropriate. But more to the fact that love between men, of course women too, but particularly men, was not uncommon. Love in a sense of a fraternal love was very common in traditional Islamic societies. Even today you'll find that, where men would spend countless times, hours and moments with one another, and in this case, particularly in a religious environment, and exchanging discourses of poetry, of ideas, and philosophical speculation. Here's another example of some poetry from the Divan-i-Shams. Come, come, for the rose bower has blossomed. Come, come, for the beloved has arrived. Bring at once all together soul and the world. Deliver over to the sun, for the sun has drawn a fine blade. Remember, his master or confidant's name is Shams Tabrizi, which means the sun from the town of Tabriz. Laugh at that ugly one showing off airs. And a lot of people thought that Shams was ugly and disheveled. He was accused of being ugly and disheveled. Weep for the friend who is severed from the friend. The whole city seethed when the rumor ran abroad that the madman had once again escaped from his chains. So this is on his return. After he was chased out of town, he comes back. What day is it? What day is it? Such a day of uprising. In other words, he's returned, so he's like celebrating. Perchance the scroll of men's deeds has already fluttered from the skies. This refers to the day of judgment, when people, this idea of will have scrolls on the right and the left side. So the right side represents your good deeds, and the left side represents your bad deeds. And he's saying that, oh, those scrolls are just collapsing into the heavens and falling on to the earth. Beat the drums and speak no more. What place is there for heart and mind? For the soul too has fled. So you can see this sort of evocative love poetry that is coming out between the relationship between these two individuals. Before I get to the Mathnavi, again, as I mentioned to you, the prodigious nature of this literature is really incredible. He composed this orally to his student who wrote this down. And this, as I mentioned, is a rhyming couplet. It consists of 25,618 rhyming couplets. It contains approximately a quarter verses of the Mathnavi are referencing the Quran. Another, probably eighth, refers to the traditions, and it has groups of parables and stories that come from both the Quran, traditions, but also certain Persian stories, as well as stories from Central Asia. And the Divanashams that I alluded to earlier has 35,000 lines, mainly dealing with the love of poetry, and that's where a lot of his love poetry became famous in the West, mainly from that. But he also wrote what was called prose. He wrote sermons, ideas about the ideal practices to live your life, more practical kinds of things. So his total output was over 60,000 lines of verse poetry, more than Homer, Dante, Milton, and Shakespeare. His Mathnavi contains 570,000 syllables, compared to Shakespeare's sonnets, which contains about 21,000. So in other words, it's massive, massive. Again, the opening lines of Mathnavi, I think given the time, I'll just focus on this slide and then we'll conclude with that. And this is a very famous opening lines of the Mathnavi. Again, it's an epic poem. Unlike the sort of odes and quatrains of the Divanashams, it's kind of like full of these couplets that talk about various discourses that could be a tale, parables, religious stories, non-religious stories, jokes, condemnations, and of course a sort of self-disclosure of the spiritual reality. Here he talks about, listen to the reed, how it tells a tale complaining of separation. It says, ever since I was parted from the reed bed, my lament has caused men and women deep sorrow. Now here, this reed, does anybody know what the reed is referring to? The reed is complaining of separation. It has a double dimension to it. On the one hand, if you recall, Rumi and his family were uprooted from Central Asia as a result of most likely the Mongol incursions coming. So he was forced to flee and go to a distant land, a land that he was unaware of, didn't do research, he didn't go on Google and see if this is a good place to raise a family, for example. Okay? He was uprooted and just wound up in Konya, central Anatolia. Didn't know what to expect. So there's a sort of a separation of that. It's a loss. Like I said, he's a refugee. And that loss often causes people to yearn back to where they're from, where they're originally from. And really only refugees and immigrants can really have that experience and hark back to that. On the other hand, it also has a theological framework, which is the separation of human beings from God, as told particularly in the story of Genesis in Adam and Eve, where they become separated from God as a result of their sin. In the context of Christianity, the original sin. In the context of Islam, as the weakness, they are then disunited from God and now here. So it has that sort of double meaning here of how it tells a tale of separation. I want a bosom torn by separation so that I may unfold to such the pain of longing. In other words, I want to be able to talk to somebody who understands me, who really can relate to what I am saying. Why? Because that double meaning is something that not everybody gets. Most people understand the obvious, patent explanation of things, but not the hidden spiritual side of things. Everybody who is left far from his origins longs for the time to be united with it. So just as he and his family longed for Central Asia, the human being is always searching, always looking for something else. Why? Because they've been separated from the divine. In every company I uttered my wailful notes, I consort with the unhappy and those that rejoice. In Turkish culture, that reed becomes a flute that is used to play. And if you ever heard the ney, which is the reed, in a sense, the instrument, it's like a wailing noise. It's a wailing kind of noise. And it's used, and a person grabs it and blows into it. So here, the reed is talking about how it is being used by different people, and then there's a breath that's blown into it, and becomes alive. That breath is deemed to be the breath of the divine. And there it sort of both wails, but also provides music, just like a human being has a double dimension, that a human being is complaining, crying, and committing bad things, but they also have beauty within itself and can produce music and positive things and so forth. Everyone became my friend from his own perception, and some do not seek the secrets from within me. In other words, everybody can pick up the ney and play it, but not everybody can really understand the deep hidden meanings of that. My secret is not far from my pain, but ear and eye lack the light to apprehend. Again, the physical, the patent, obvious realities are hidden to those who only look at them and don't dig deeper to elevate their soul to understand. Body is not veiled from soul, nor soul from body, yet none is permitted to see the soul. Again, this notion that the body and the soul are separate and can never join only occurs when people don't reach that spiritual level. And this goes on. So this is like the first 18 verses of the Mathnavi. The first opening set is about 35, 36 verses, and then he goes on and tells different tales and so on and so forth. But it's really interesting, but because of lack of time, I'll move on. Here's another, I think, important verse. And this is an interesting story. It's not so much a story, but a perspective. And it's one of my favorite sayings of Rumi. And it's called a guest house verse, but I call it the guest house verse as well, because the question is, what is the guest house? This human being is a guest house. Well, I guess that's kind of obvious. Every morning is a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight, the dark thought, the shame, the malice. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Again, what he's doing is he's taking a twist from the social etiquette of Islamic thought, which is being hospitable to neighbors. In fact, there's a very famous tradition in the Islamic concept, Islamic thought, which says that a traveler who's traveling through a city is to be welcomed as a guest for 3 days. So somebody who's living and the guest travels through, because in those days it was difficult to travel. So if they come into your city or town, you're supposed to welcome them for 3 days. So physically feed them, take care of them. That's the general view and the ethos of Islamic thought. What does he do? He again puts a psychological component to this. So what are we talking about here? What's the visitor? What do you think the visitor is? Yeah, it's your emotions. It's your feelings. So throughout the day, in the morning, the afternoon, evening, sometime we all have a sense of, usually, a change in feelings, right? I don't feel good today. People often say, I don't feel good today. Yeah? Could be a depression, could be a state of happiness, regret, a complaint. When that occurs, he's saying, just like you would welcome all these physical guests, welcome them all. Ignore it. Just let it happen and move on with your life. So it puts a psychological spin on an otherwise well-known social etiquette. And that's what thinkers like Rumi and Sufis do. I will reserve this for a question, if people have, about what his view about reason and logic is. Finally, I'll end with this, which is, when it comes to religion and the Quran, he says, my son, don't read the Quran for outward sense. A demon looks on man and just sees clay. The outward Quran is like man's body. Its features visible, its soul concealed. A man owns kith and kin may never know. His soul a hair's breadth in 100 years. In other words, again, when you read the spiritual texts, the traditions and so forth, don't just focus only on the literal meaning and the outward aspect of it, but go beyond and go into the deeper meanings. Finally, to conclude, as you probably well know, he's been a big influence not only in the Muslim world. In fact, one of the very famous scholar and poet in the 16th century called Rumi's Mathnavi, the Quran in Persian. So in the Muslim world, he's very popular, particularly in the Turkish, South Asian, and Persian-speaking world. But also he's had a huge impact on the West, in thinkers such as Hegel, the Jewish theologian Martin Buber, and of course the perennial philosophers such as Schuon and Guénon. Most recently, in the late 80s and 1990s, some American poets began to publish works by Rumi, such as Coleman Barks and Robert Bly, particularly taking certain poetry and making it accessible to a more American audience. And it's as a result of those kinds of efforts, Rumi became one of the most read poets in the United States, particularly in the mid-1990s. Finally, let me conclude, and there's this band called Junoon. I don't know if you are familiar with it. There's a Pakistani band in the mid-2000s by the name of Junoon that was very popular because they used to mix sort of contemporary, popular music with a sort of Sufi orientation, and they would particularly rely on Rumi, and they have performed before the United Nations and so forth. But what's interesting was I was listening to an interview one of their band leaders had on NPR a few years ago, especially after they performed for the United Nations, and the journalist asked them, so what are your influences? And because they talk about tolerance and love and peace, and they said, well, one of our biggest influences is Rumi. And he was somebody who believed in peace and love, and he wasn't a very religious kind of guy, and so on and so forth. And I think that a lot of times people sort of mistake the idea of love and tolerance with lack of religion. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about Rumi. And here you have an orthodox theologian jurist who at the same time has a worldview that consists of tolerance, love, and peace. And it's not because of lack of religion, because his focus stems from the character idea of the Prophet Muhammad. So it's rooted in religion and not outside. And I think that's important to understand because a lot of people will sort of skip that over and say, well, he was this kind of liberal Sufi kind of hanging out, and that's why he produced those wonderful verses and so forth. And certainly one can make that kind of argument, but it would be an incomplete picture of Rumi. So with that, I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Where do we, thank you, that was fantastic. Where do we start? Do we jump right into the Mathnavi? What's the edition you recommend? Because there's a lot to read, but is there a first stop that you'd recommend?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so I brought a couple of works. There's a lot of translations available, but I think that if you really want to get an idea, I always recommend that you start with a book about the book, as opposed to diving right in. I mean, some people would disagree with me, but particularly when it's a piece of religious literature, and particularly if it's in a different language, because the language translation makes a big difference, and understanding what the contours are important. So for example, I never tell people, if you want to learn Islam, here's a Quran, because it's a very difficult text to understand. So I would recommend reading two scholars of Rumi that to me are really unsurpassed. One is a more a traditional scholar from Harvard by the name of Anne Marie Schimmel. She's very well known. She's just a brilliant scholar from German extract who translated things in Arabic and Persian and so forth. But Anne Marie Schimmel wrote a book on Rumi, and there's been a couple of revisions of the title, so I don't remember exactly, but I think something like The Triumphal Sun may be the one, or just The Teachings of Rumi, I think is the title. A more recent, she's been talking about Rumi since the 80s and 90s. She's no longer alive, but she's just a brilliant scholar. A second, more recent work is by Franklin Lewis, who actually teaches at the University of Chicago, who produced, I would say, an encyclopedic work of Rumi. And I think it's called The Life and Works of Rumi. It's a really thick book, but it is the most comprehensive book about Rumi, both historically speaking, but also in terms of his literature. Now, in terms of the actual poetry, there's the best poetry translation I've come across on the Divan Shams. These are the lyrical love poetry, is by A.J. Arbery, a very famous scholar of Islamic texts. It's been revised by, again, very important scholars, called The Mystical Poems of Rumi. It's got 400 poems, and they're translated both correctly, but also correctly in the sense that it keeps intact what he would argue is the intention of Rumi and his sort of religious philosophical background. As far as the Mathnavi is concerned, there is a series that just was published by Oxford Press. I think it's Penguin Publication, Oxford, a few years ago. I think they're now on volume 3 by a guy by the name of Javed Mojaddidi. Javed Mojaddidi, sorry about the spelling, which is an excellent translation because it also is in rhyme. Because all the poems are in Persian, so if you really want to really experience Rumi at its core, you have to know Persian. But most of us don't. But he's the closest in both producing the actual meaning in a rhyme format. So I would say go with Javed Mojaddidi. It's published by Oxford Press. Finally, there is a work of prose, which includes some sermons and so forth. It's kind of interesting writings, which was translated by Wheeler Thaxton. He's another brilliant translator of Eastern texts from Harvard. And this is published by Shambhala Press, which publishes a lot of spiritual writings and so forth. So I think that's a good place. Those are some good places to start.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. I was wondering about his wife and if she was intellectually or artistically significant and if she influenced him or what kind of role she played.
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to ask that. I was hoping we would run out of questions, but his wife, he mentions his wife, but he mentions her in the context, oddly enough, in terms of marriage and love, and how he, oftentimes was very attracted to his wife, and so forth. I don't know if she played a role in his prodigious writings and poetry. Oddly enough, I don't think she did, given his incredible relationship with Shams Tabrizi. What's that? Yeah. So that would be my answer. But to be frank, I don't know enough of that particular area. I haven't researched it enough. But that's a good question. Maybe I'll research it and see if I can find some things in the writings. But if you read most of his works and the works about him, her role doesn't really come out as a pronounced role in his life. She was there, of course. They had kids together that were instrumental. But back in those days, particularly in classical Islamic period, men didn't talk about their relationship with their spouses and their wives. In fact, they would have a tendency, because it was a private matter. You don't discuss that kind of stuff. There was a tendency to talk about women scholars that you studied with more so than talking about your own wives. So, for example, Ibn Arabi, the great theosophical thinker in Islamic history, in his hagiographical work, he mentions women scholars that he studied with as being very important for his spiritual development.
I have a question from someone that sent in the question through the internet. It's rather long, and my pronunciation may be faulty, so please forgive me. Ibn Arabi was living in Damascus. It is believed that both Rumi and at another time Shams visited him. It is obvious that Shams did not care for Ibn Arabi's project as reported in his own book. And this book was recently translated by Poetic. What is your take on the spiritual backbiting done by very Sufis?
Can you repeat the last phrase? The spiritual what?
What is your take on this spiritual backbiting done by these Sufis?
Backbiting?
Yes, backbiting.
Backbiting. I'm not sure what that means, but the problem is that there is uncertainty about the meeting between Ibn Arabi who would have been significantly older, and Rumi. Rather, what we do know is that the sort of same, I would say, sort of philosophical system that was expounded by Ibn Arabi is somewhat related to much of the systematic ideas of Rumi, particularly in the context of theosophy, the notion of form and the notion of surface is very prevalent in Rumi, meaning what is obvious and real and what is esoteric and behind that, obvious, patent real. But what's interesting, though, is that one of Ibn Arabi's major students, a guy by the name of Kunawi, actually was a student of Rumi's. So the connection, I think, comes from Kunawi, who expounds and becomes a very important student and exponent of Ibn Arabi's writings beyond the Middle East, because Ibn Arabi was mainly in Damascus, or at least what we call Bilad al-Sham, the greater Syria area. That's where he was writing and working and living. And Kunawi then goes into the Anatolian area and expounds this teaching. And he's a very important, I would say, important exponent of that view of what we call the unity of being. The unity of being is an important doctrine of Ibn Arabi. And I think that played somewhat of a guiding role for Jalaluddin Rumi.
I'm not sure how to phrase this, but I'm wondering how Rumi's relationship with Shams influenced his love poetry. Was there an intermingling of love of humans with love of God? Did it enhance his love of God? What was the relationship there?
Yeah, I think the relationship between Shams and Rumi really took the traditional idea of loving God, which was, at a very, I don't want to say superficial, but at a very general level. Like, you should love God, yeah, because He created you, He has given you everything, so you should generally love God. That's the way most believers and practitioners would look. But it seems that Shams Tabrizi really made it the focus of the religion, made it focus of the theology, made it the focus of spiritual practices, such that everything was about love. And that's why you begin to see this incredible, development of the concepts of love and the relationship between the two men in verse form, which did not precede the meeting of the two men. So before that, he didn't write poetry at all. He was typically just doing his teaching and his religious practices, normal religious practices. But it's after that meeting you see this incredible poetry spewing forth. I mean,
Okay.
you find it all through the text. You find it all through the text where he says, look on me, for I shall be your companion in the grave on that night when you pass across the shop and house. I mean, all these 400 poems, most of them are about their relationship.
Prior to his writing, was he teaching about love?
That's a very good question. It's not clear, but probably not. Not to the extent that was anything unusual. In other words, like I said, Ghazali, who preceded him by 150 years, also talked about love. But even for Ghazali, it wasn't like, the only thing that he taught. And when Ghazali wrote about it, he was talking in the context of putting this plan of how to live your life in an optimal way, and love was a component of that. And I think that was the general perspective that many people had. But with this encounter, love takes over, and it becomes the central theme of his work and teachings.
Thank you for the nice talk. We not knowing the Persian and all, the original source, we get to see in the internet some, quotes here and there, and some of them are so deep. I mean, just so small sentences. Just for example, one thing struck me is that shine like a whole universe is yours, Rumi.
Mm.
Shine like the whole universe is yours. I mean, so deep. Simple sentences like that. Everywhere you see, it's amazing contribution he has done.
Yeah, it really
Thank
is.
you.
I mean, thank you for that. As I mentioned, you find just one couplet so amazing and so deep. Just based on time and sort of estimation, he's writing 14 to 15 of those a day, filled with just perfect, at least structure, the Persian structure of the lyrical form, perfect structure, plus with incredible meaning. It's really an extraordinary effort. I mean, just to read this I mean, I read these 400 poems. I got to read them like 10 times to really get them inside me. I don't know how this guy did this. Yeah.
It's a very simple question. I'm just curious, how long did he live? How old was he? And how long did he write poetry for? Like, how many years was that?
He wrote poetry probably about 30 years, and he lived to his late 60s. I think it was 12, I think I said 1207 to 1273 are the dates, typically. So he lived to almost 70, but he wrote for about 30 years. Yeah. It's a long time. And that's what happens when you don't have the internet. or cell phones,
What did his contemporaries think of him? Like, was he a fan favorite?
You mean, was he a rock star? Is that what you're asking? No, he wasn't. That's a very difficult, you're asking the most difficult questions tonight. I just realized that. That's a difficult question because in order to know that, you really have to scour all of the literature and scholars in the region, contemporaneous, and see if they're talking about him, or ask them, what do you think of Rumi? That didn't happen, obviously. No one went around asking. But what historians have noticed is that during his time, when people would write about, for example, the history of Konya or the history of Anatolia during that time period, some of the contemporary writers did not mention him. Okay? So probably, and that's not unusual. A lot of times, some scholars get big, like Al-Ghazali was big in his time. When he wrote his massive work called the Ihya Ulumuddin, it was like a bestseller and everyone knew about it. But I think within his community of Konya, he certainly was well known and respected. But I would say outside of the Konya region, particularly in the Middle East, he probably wasn't. Why? Probably because the Persian issue. In other words, if you lived in an environment or a culture of Persian writings and literature, then you would probably know his stuff. But outside of that, you wouldn't. But certainly within 150, 200 years after Rumi's death, he becomes huge. Yeah, then he becomes well-known. Like I said, Jami, a well-known thinker and poet, I think 300 years later, says that the Mathnavi is the Persian Quran, which is a big deal because that's like almost, it's kind of controversial to compare the writing of a theologian to the Quran, which is the Word of God. But to be able to say that publicly in writing is a big deal. And even today in South Asia, Iran and Turkey, and interestingly enough, all these different regions claim Rumi as their own. They sort of have these little fights over, well, he's really ours because he's like the Iranians say, well, he wrote in Persian, so of course he's our guy. And the Turks are like, no, he's Turkish, and his tomb is there, so he's Turkish. And the Afghans are like, wait a minute, he was born in Afghanistan. And then the Tajiks say, no, actually he's born in Tajikistan. So you have 4 different countries and regions trying to claim him. But today he's huge. But I have to say one thing, though. I think, in the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century, he has not been as well received as he was historically. I think that it's a political reason, because the role of Persian in the Muslim world has waned. Okay, it's waned. Whereas Persian, regardless of where you were, people read Persian. Like, my family's from India, and even if their native tongue is Urdu, everybody read Persian. At least they knew some amount of Persian so they can read Rumi and other poets. And Persian was the courtly language of the Mughal Empire. the largest empire in South Asia for hundreds of years. And of course, Persian was important in the regions of the Middle East, but with the rise of Arab nationalism and the rise of fundamentalism in the Muslim world, Persian poetry and Persian writings become less important. And then, of course, Rumi is deemed to be controversial because of things that we talked about today. The whole idea of love and ecstatic sayings become controversial, particularly with those who are focused on the literal meaning of religious texts, such as the Quran and the Hadith, a literal rendering of those. They would find all this stuff, if not controversial, perhaps even blasphemous.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
How he was received in the current.
Yeah, so certainly ISIS would not read Rumi.
Right.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yes, I was just curious about if he had any maybe philosophies or ideas about, let's say, with the way governance is, or with money itself, if it was against his core beliefs or anything like that, and then also a third facet would be on maybe his philosophy on things that were like a mystery, like some phenomena that happen that can't easily be explained by science, like maybe ghosts or any other type of mysterious phenomena as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are three separate questions. Okay. If you're asking about democracy, no, he did not believe in democracy. In terms of governance, back then, whoever became your patron was your acceptable government. So it didn't really matter to these kinds of thinkers. I shouldn't say it didn't matter. It did matter as long as they weren't completely a-religious, drunkards or something like that. But in this case, he was patronized by the local prince called Kayqubad. I forget his first name, but Kayqubad was the guy who really supported him, and he was basically what you could call a warlord, a regional warlord. But then as the Mongols came into the area, he was also respectful of the Mongols because they also left him alone. So I think that in those days, particularly for scholars, their livelihood often depended on certain rulers and certain regional authorities. So they didn't really question, those kinds of things, unless, of course, they started going against the religion and things like that. The issue about ghosts and spirits, that has always remained. So his view would be, yes, there are such things, because that's part and parcel of the Muslim worldview, which is the existence of spirits and demons and jinns and things like that. So he doesn't talk that much about them, but they are part of some of the stories, the parables and stories in the Mathnavi. And he would certainly recognize them as realities. He wouldn't dismiss them. What was your second question?
Well, it had to do with money.
Okay, yeah. So like other Sufis, to them, any sign of ostentation, of greed, and unnecessary wealth would be, viewed with certainly suspicion, and in most cases, rejection. I mean, you need some basic livelihood to live. You need a comfortable home and dress and things like that. But for them, any excessive material wealth would be something that they would look with suspicion and not appreciate. Yeah.
It's a technical question. How did people in those days learn of his writings? How would his poetry have gotten around?
Yeah. Okay, so how did people become aware of his writings? Well, they actually had scribes that would publish books. Yeah. So you would often have manuscripts that somebody would write. So in terms of his writings, they were written down by his students, particularly a guy by the name of Azam Nizamuddin who wrote the text. And then they'd be copied by scribes and then sold and distributed like you would find at a bookstore. So that's how that would typically happen. And you can still find actually some of his original manuscripts, or at least ones that were 100 or 200 years after his death. You can find them in the Rumi Museum in Konya, written in the Persian. And some of them were very nicely stylized with colorings and so on and so forth. So, sort of embellished with different kinds of materials, colors, and so forth. But publishing and book writing was very prominent in the Muslim world. So finding books was not an issue.